pleasure to introduce to you Professor Joshua Ramey, who is currently assistant professor in the philosophy department at Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa. Dr. Ramey got his PhD from Villanova University in 2006, and immediately afterwards started teaching of all places at Rowan University, where he was for 3 years, and has subsequently taught at Haverford for quite some time and now at Grinnell. He's the author of an almost innumerable list of articles published in a variety of different journals. He's also got a book, The Hermetic Deleuze, which came out with Duke in 2012. He is the editor of a series at Palgrave called Radical Theologies. He is also the distinguished co-translator with yours truly of Francois Laruelle's Mystique non-philosophique à l'usage des contemporains, or non-philosophical mysticism for today's use, which we hope to actually have finished this year. And he's currently working on a book, which is coming out next year, on neoliberalism and divination, basically. And what he's going to present to us today is a draft chapter, some sort of work from that project. And the talk is entitled Money and Metaphysics, and I would like you to join me in welcoming Professor Ramey.
Thanks, Ed. It's really great to be back here. I drove down from Philly today, which is where I'm on leave this term from Grinnell, and trees are really popping on the road on the way down here. It's beautiful, and it brought back a lot of great memories of driving down here between 2007 and 2010 when I was here with several others of you who are in this room right now. It's really good to be back, and I want to thank Ed and David and the department and everyone for having me back. I want to talk to you about money and metaphysics today, and it is related to the larger book project that Ed mentioned. It's not technically a chapter, but it's part of the research that's behind the book, and I can tell you more about that maybe in the Q&A. But I want to get started a little bit casually here before I start reading at you for a little while. And I want to do that by talking about the way in which money is normally understood, the vast majority of economic textbooks. When you open your intro to econ text, almost always what you'll immediately have when it comes to the subject of money is a list of the functions that money is supposed to perform. It's supposed to be a medium of exchange, a unit account, a store of value. And that's all well and good as far as it goes. But this is the answer to a question: what does money do? Right? What has money done, or what money can do? Right? And what I'm interested in is a slightly different question today, which is, what is money? Not what does money do, but what is money? And you have to sort of find your way into this question intellectually, because it's a little bit abstract. So that's what I want to start off with here. So, is money the paper that it's printed on? Is money gold and silver? Is money just an idea? Well, we could answer in some ways yes and in some ways no to all of those questions. When I talk about the metaphysics of money today, I am not simply going to be thinking about how we functionally define money, which is very important to talk about for a number of reasons. I'm going to be asking something different, and you could think your way into this. Come on, by thinking to yourself: is the paper money is printed on worth it? There's this old expression. Is it worth the money? Is it worth the money? Well, what about the paper that we use to print money on? Should we bother anymore to print money on paper? It seems like kind of a waste, right? Because what? We can store money in computers using ones and zeros. Why have currency around anymore? In a lot of ways, we're already moving towards something like a cashless society, and people seem to be really into that. So, is paper money, the paper money printed on really worth it? Well, no, not really, not anymore. So, this shows just in a way how weird the question is, what is money? You might think that there's no point in asking it at all. But there is a point, and that's what I want to talk about today. But before we do that, I want to try to convey to you something of what I mean by this rather arcane term, metaphysics. There are lots of different, and some of them, a lot of them really good definitions of what a metaphysical question is or what metaphysics is. I'm going to use a rather classical one, which comes from the Greek philosopher Aristotle. And in a way, the word or the term metaphysics didn't signify for Aristotle a sort of separate area of inquiry or research in the sense that we say maybe the sciences are different from the humanities or something like this. In fact, the whole reason why his work, The Metaphysics, is called that is simply because it comes after the book called The Physics that he wrote, which is his theory of nature. But there is something to it in the sense that metaphysical questions are questions that arise at a very, very general level about the nature of being as such, or what it is to be a thing, or what kinds of questions we can ask about existence in general. And in that sense, it sort of goes beyond what you might think of as kind of the regional disciplines of physics or chemistry or economics or biology. And Aristotle thought that there were at least 4 different ways to answer this question of what something is, the what is it question. Okay, and he said you could do this in terms of causes. Okay, so what causes something to be what it is? And Aristotle thought that everything that existed was answerable to these 4 questions. What is the shape of something? What's its form or structure? That's what he called its formal cause. What stuff, what kind of matter or substance is it made out of? That's what Aristotle calls the material cause. What energy or power must something have in order to exist? And that's what he called the efficient cause. And finally, what is the purpose or goal of this thing that exists? And that's what he called the final cause. And just to give you an example that's not money, when we answer the question of what a tree is, according to Aristotle, we refer to these 4 causes. We say that a tree is what it is because it has a certain form. It has roots, trunks, branches, and leaves, and so on. It's composed of organic matter. That's the material cause. Carbon and oxygen, and so on at that level. It depends to some extent on sunlight, water, and soil, which is going to be the efficient cause of the tree being what it is and the way it is. And finally, the purpose or goal of a tree is to grow as much as it can and be as healthy as it can relative to its environment. right? That's its purpose in being a tree, okay? So now, what in the world are we going to do with this when it comes to money? How are answering these kinds of questions going to help us think about money, and why should we even bother? And to put this sort of pointedly, before we even ask what money is, if we've got something that works as a medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value, does it really matter that we know what it is metaphysically? Let me put that point again. If money functions, right, why do we need to ask what makes it possible for cowrie shells or gold or dollars or bitcoins or anything else to perform these functions? And if we have a form of money that works for us now, why do we need to know maybe about past forms of money? Well, there's a reason. The reason is this: modern money does not function very well as the medium of exchange, the unit account, and the store of values that societies and individuals depend on it to be. Almost all modern economists, from Keynes to Hayek to Samuelson to Friedman, people across the political spectrum, agree that there's something very, very troubling about the nature of money, and that whatever that trouble is, it's something that economists in particular should be concerned to fix in order that the economy, the economic life in general, can be what we want it to be, which is some kind of means of allocating scarce resources based on a variety of ends and desires and purposes that we have. And again, it turns out that almost all modern economists, and this is across the political spectrum, recognize that there was a problem in money, and that problem is what's called the problem of hoarding. There's something about money itself, quite apart from what it can get for us on markets, that makes people want to hoard it. And by hoarding it, to attain massive amounts of social power that people who don't have money cannot command. Now, the interesting thing is that last I checked, and I've been studying economic theory for 5 or 6 years now, this is not a desirable situation according to almost any seriously thinking economist. And a lot of people, myself included, think that at least part of the solution to the massive amounts of wealth inequality that we're currently faced with in global capitalism has something to do with changing the nature of money. So we have to understand what money is if we want to set about changing it and perhaps addressing inequality. And the way I go about this is to try to develop what I call a structural, genetic, and political account of money. And when I say structural, genetic, and political, it basically corresponds to what Aristotle calls the formal, efficient, and final causes. And what I mean by that is that I want to ask these questions. What gives money the particular structure it has in a certain time and place? What gives money its power and authority to do what it does? And what purposes is money said to serve? And by the way, I'm leaving out the material cause of money, even though it's actually very interesting and has interesting problems associated with it too. But just for the record, the material basis of money has historically and across the globe been a whole bunch of different things. As I mentioned earlier, from cowrie shells to cattle to giant rocks, gold and silver, bytes of computers. Maybe some of you are holding bitcoins these days. Even time itself has served as a form of currency. Okay. I mentioned the current reality of inequality. This is just one of many, many graphs that will show you, if you go trolling for it online, just how bad wealth inequality has gotten since the late 1970s. The earning power of the top 1%, 0.01% actually, has grown astronomically Most other earning brackets have stagnated since the late 70s. There's lots of different debates about what has caused this and what is making it continue. But what I'm trying to do here with the metaphysics of money is coming out of my own concern, as well as the concern of the thinkers I'm in alliance with and the activist groups I care about, that this is a huge problem and we need to address it. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to start reading for a little bit, and I'm going to try to read this as slowly as I can. And I know it's a little awkward and uncomfortable when we're all under these bright fluorescent lights feeling like we're being interrogated, but if something is flying by too quickly and you want to stop me, just raise your hand, okay? And if you still feel too shy to do that, we'll have plenty of time to go back over things in the Q&A, all right? Since the late 1970s, there's been a massive and exponential growth of wealth inequality in the capitalist world. Most of this inequality is rooted in financial capital, or money capital, where it is possible to make money on money alone. Unlike traditional forms of investing, where investors only profit if the industry they invest in also profits, there are now more and more ways to profit from the failure of others. By hedging or trading in options, futures, and derivatives, it's possible to bet both for and against the success or failure of various enterprises, even the success or failure of governments, the likelihood of terrorist attacks, and climate change itself. All of these have become ways of making ever more money. There are particular features of the current money form that allow this absurd form of speculation not only to exist, but to dominate economic life. Changing the currency may not be sufficient for stopping this madness before it destroys most of life on Earth, but most concerned political economists agree that it is one of the necessary conditions for reversing inequality and ending the ability to profit from disaster, catastrophe, warfare, and violence. People, institutions, and governments benefiting from the way money is currently understood, defined, acquired, and possessed do not want the current form of money to change. People, institutions, and governments not benefiting from the current money form are much more open to change. If those benefiting from the current form of currency don't want it to change, they will have to convince the rest of us that either it should not or cannot or never will change. There are various ways to do this. One is to use brute force or exploitation, i.e. through enslavement to debt or enforced labor or threat of social exclusion. All of these means to keep people in agreement with the sacredness of the current money form have been used in the past and are still in use. But it's much more efficient to motivate people to believe for themselves a whole series of intertwined myths that will encourage them on their own terms to accept the current money form. These myths include, we all deserve our lot in life, we get what we deserve, the cream rises to the top, you have to work if you want to eat, everyone has a fair shot at success, markets are level playing fields, everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and so on. These myths may or may not be true. But one of the most powerful myths is that the current form of money is the best, most efficient, and really the only way for people in a mass society like global capitalism to coordinate and communicate with one another. Supposedly, we use money to signal what we want and what we're willing to sacrifice for what we want. And it's true that we do seem to use money in this way. But here's the problem. Think about what it says on a dollar bill. It says, among other things, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. But think about this. If dollar bills represent the ability to pay debts, then what does the ability to pay debts represent? It should represent that one is either employed or employable, that one has assets or collateral, even if that is simply one's own labor power. Such should be the basis of a loan. Money should represent everything we think of as having real value, from cars to houses to works of art, healthy food, the talents of doctors, even the love between parents and children. But the three most lucrative enterprises on earth right now are drug trafficking, illegal arms dealing, and the buying and selling of women into human slavery. If we always put our money where our mouth is, then all we are in global capitalism is that the most valuable things are drugs, guns, and prostitutes. Either this is what is truly valuable and everything is fine, or this is not what is valuable, and so following the money is not going to lead us to the values we actually hold. In that case, money is failing to be the medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value of the things we actually think are valuable. But if money is not representing value, then what does it represent? Let's go back to the dollar bill. Legal tender for all debts, public and private. The boss owes the laborer money. The boss owes the bank money. The laborer also owes the bank money. The bank owes other banks money, and nations owe money to banks and each other. It's all debt. If all debts were paid, what would happen? There'd be no more money. Since most currency comes into existence in the form of private bank loans, 95% at last count, money as we know it might effectively disappear in this situation. And if there were no more debts, no one might be forced to work for anyone else against their own desire and inclination by the need for money. In either case, money's role in social life would change so dramatically as to become unrecognizable. If we all had access to basic goods and services and the ability to express ourselves creatively without the money form we use, then what would money be for? It might disappear. We'll talk about what a situation like that might look like at the end of my talk. But to put the question more pointedly, given the massive inequalities in wealth we currently face, in which it is increasingly difficult for the vast majority of human beings to meet basic needs without enslavement to debt or excessive and undesirable working hours, then what is money really for today? It doesn't seem to be a medium that is working very well as a means of exchange if people can't acquire enough of it to get what they need and what they want. And if not enough of us have it to express our desires and needs, then what is it worth as a store of value? And if it is used to keep records or accounts of values almost no one can express, then it becomes a language that is either spoken by no one or that is dominated only by a few mantras, such as, gotta find a job, and we must all pay our debts, or my current favorite, lean in. So how did we get here? How does the money form enable the oppression and domination of most of us by a few of us? One way to understand this problem is to take the approach of Karl Marx and distinguish use value from exchange value. Use values are what we mean generally when we use the term value. They are just the pleasure, usefulness, and sense of fulfillment we derive from what enables our activities and self-expression, from the beds we sleep in, to the food we eat, to the instruments we play. The value we take in a good night's sleep or decent food or a good set of drums is called use value. Exchange value is something different. Exchange value is what a bed or a meal or a drum set is apparently worth to other people who may or may not have the same desires and preferences that we do. The key term here is apparently. Marketplaces where things are bought and sold are places where the value of commodities like beds or meals or drum sets are represented as having prices. In other words, those prices appear as representations of value. That's exchange value. So you only have exchange values when you have markets. Now, even though we might like to think so, and despite what you learn in marginal price theory, prices do not actually represent use value. Ideally, in perfect markets where everyone who wishes to can in principle buy or sell, and no one has the power to fix prices by forming cabals or monopolies, prices are supposed to be fair, in the sense that they would then reflect an aggregate or average of what values all invested parties would be willing to part with and or what they'd be willing to pursue. If iPhones are worth more than other smartphones, then the price people are willing to pay is rational or makes sense if it's a reflection of what consumers actually find more valuable. Prices in this sense are supposed to be a form of information sharing, a communication in society about what is valuable and what is not. Prices are also supposed to be, in some sense, democratic, enabling people to assert their demands and express their preferences through taking or asking for prices. But even the most ardent champions of free markets will admit this can only be fair and prices can only be rational if there are enough buyers and sellers that there's an element of randomness or chance involved, making it impossible to predict or control the direction that prices will take. And markets are really only potentially attuned to use values at equilibrium, when supply and demand curves meet such that producers cannot squeeze more cash out of consumers than consumers really want to pay, which happens, by the way, when there's too much supply and not enough demand, as all of you economics students in here know. There are many problems with making markets work perfectly efficiently, and most economists would admit that no market has ever embodied the ideal. But Marx argued that even if we had efficient markets, the money form would still prevent us from having the access to the goods and services we want and need. Marx called money a fetish for this reason, a material object that we imbue with mysterious spiritual powers. Money as prices are a fetish because exchange values, unlike use values, are not direct transcriptions of use values, but abstract representations of aggregates of use values at a particular time and place in particular markets, even if this is a so-called global market. In other words, even though you're led to think this, it really isn't as if the entire world has been randomly surveyed and everyone has agreed to pay the price that iPhones are going for. There's always a limited number of people who have what's called effective demand, who can make their presence felt in markets, and there's always a limited number of producers and certain kinds of controls that they have over supply, over distribution, over finance, and so on. And yet, because consumers depend on income to supply their own needs and desires, they are forced to work and are forced to act as if money does represent use values, their own private particular use values, when in fact they don't. Use values are constantly changing, but within a given market and given economic conditions, exchange values are relatively static. And money represents as price only exchange values. To the extent that we want to use money to access use values, we must do so within the limits or confines of the exchange values that are currently represented by the given productive enterprises or financial or service industries that are currently profitable. Thus, money is only ever at best a partial representation of use value and at worst a massive distortion of it. Do we really think that only Nike or New Balance is capable of making good sneakers? Or is it rather that Nike's monopoly power over supply lines, superstar athlete endorsements, and deals with retailers make it almost inconceivable for competitors to survive? Even worse, even with perfect competition in the sneaker industry, would the cost of sneakers really represent their universal use value relative to other goods and services? The cost of Nikes would be justified only if the rest of life, from eating and sleeping to loving and playing and working, could all be represented as an athletics competition we needed sneakers for, instead of, say, ballet shoes or Doc Martens or loafers. But Nike has convinced us, whether you're a rapper or a stay-at-home mom or a financial planner, you just do it. The human social world did not naturally evolve into the idea that all of life is like sports, and so sneakers are really, really, really important. Most of us, I hope, have a lot of other non-athletic values like love and care and creativity and vulnerability and faith and hope. And I hope we still like actual food better than muscle supplements and energy drinks. I'm not sure though. But if so, then why do sports drinks and sneaker industries have such massive market shares and their CEOs so handsomely compensated as opposed to, say, what someone in child care or education or hospice care is making? Part of the problem is that money is an abstract representation of exchange values, which are not a reflection of consumer choices, but of the needs and demands of production and finance at a given time and place, of what Marx called the society of producers. And we should include in that the society of financiers. As a representation of the interest of those successful enough to be able to invest it, money is a kind of permanent indebtedness of the present to the economic past. Exchange value congealed in the money form, can be preserved there even though economic circumstances on the ground have changed. Let me give you an example. One can, for instance, have made a killing in VHS tapes. The money made on VHS tapes does not go out of existence, even though now we all watch Netflix or DVDs. But whoever made the VHS tape killing, because she has money, now has tremendous social power and tremendous effective demand, even though there is no more use value for VHS tapes. Exchange value in the form of money allows this intrepid entrepreneur to have power to lend or spend or reinvest money, even though no one cares about VHS anymore. That might seem fine as long as she reinvests in some new useful technology, or maybe even lends at zero interest as part of some kind of social entrepreneurship. But because money is an abstract representation of exchange values alone and is disconnected from use values, this person can go out and, for example, bet against the success of the economy of Thailand. And when Thailand devolves into chaos, can profit and make even more money from the destruction of value rather than its continued production. We can bet against economic success and profit because money does not represent use value but exchange value. And exchange values in the form of money can exist indifferently and even with destructive consequences for economic life. But if we are bound to the form of money we currently have, an abstract representation of exchange value, then there really is no choice but to hoard as much of it as possible in order to guarantee our ability to meet our needs and desires in the future, even if that means, for the 0.01%, to seek more and more ways to profit from the control and subjugation of the rest of us, including the outright destruction of the earth itself. Let me put the problem somewhat differently. As long as no needs or demands are put into circulation, there's really no need for more money. That is, if money were really working in this way. But those in positions of great wealth seek to increase that wealth and power simply in order to preserve and maintain what they have. In order to do this, the consumers must be encouraged to need and want ever more and differently than they do. They must develop irrational demands to keep up with the irrationally increasing supply of money. Why does the money supply keep increasing out of step with the production of value? Partly, this has to do with the unhooking of money from the gold standard and fixed rates of exchange in the early 70s, but which somewhat limited the amount of currency governments and banks could produce. But there was still an incentive to hoard gold and to maintain power through it, the disastrous consequences of which had a great deal to do with both World War I and the Great Depression. Returning to the gold standard is not the answer. In order to understand the irrationality of hoarding money, it's very important to undo the myth here that by hoarding, the wealthiest 1% are somehow just trying to do what any of the rest of us would do, enjoy their lives in relative peace and security, and provide for their families and their futures. The 0.1% have extracted massive amounts of money from productive activities and are hoarding it in tax havens. That hoarding is justified only by the identification of money with power, not with the real social wealth that power is able through money to control. As hoarded, money represents a force to control, dominate, and even destroy social wealth, or to reproduce it only in keeping with the demands of those who command the ability to invest, or more importantly, to not invest. Much of the reason the wealthiest are not investing currently is because they can make much more on financial markets than they can on loaning to productive enterprises. Part of the reason for this is that there are very real limits to compound growth. It might be an incentive for the wealthiest to invest if the global economy could be thought to grow endlessly at a compound rate of 3 to 4%. But there are real limits to growth. Human animals have a finite set of desires and needs. Geography, climate, politics, religion, and culture all determine needs and wants that are never unlimited and so cannot grow indefinitely. By definition, an organism designed only for indefinite growth is a cancer. And by simple mathematics, infinite or endless growth on a finite planet is physically impossible. Despite contemporary appearances to the contrary, the purpose of economic life should not be the accumulation of wealth for its own sake. It only appears that this is the goal because too many of us are unable to meet our demands for basic goods and services without money. And this, in turn, is because more and more of social life has come with a price tag, so that those with massive amounts of wealth can have more and more power and control. And in the end, almost all economists agree that vast levels of wealth inequality radically undermines the very point of economic life, which is for human beings to produce and share goods and services with one another. Clearly, this is not, or is no longer, if it ever was, what organizes economic activity. Rather than thinking of what use values are required or demanded by actual existence on Earth, capitalist subjects, like you and me, are forced to adjust their expectations for their lives based on the availability of jobs on the market and the affordability of goods and services. This forces endless monetized trade-offs between security and adventure, between safety and play, between having enough and sharing with others, between work and life itself. Your money or your life. It's up to you. So what's the solution? The great 20th century economist John Maynard Keynes thought that we needed to radically limit or eliminate any incentive to holding money. Keynes put the problem this way. When the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. We shall be able to rid ourselves of many of the pseudo-moral principles which have hag-ridden us for 200 years, by which we have exalted some of the most distasteful of human qualities into the position of the highest virtues. We should be able to afford to dare to assess the money motive at its true value. The love of money as a possession, as distinguished from the love of money as a means to the enjoyment and realities of life, will be recognized for what it is, a somewhat disgusting morbidity, one of those semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensities which one hands over with a shudder to the specialists on mental disease. All kinds of social customs and economic practices affecting the distribution of wealth and of economic rewards and penalties, which we now maintain at all costs, however distasteful and unjust they may be in themselves, because they are tremendously useful in promoting accumulation of capital, we shall then be free at last to discard. One of the changes to currency that John Maynard Keynes was interested in, and I'm going to talk about here now, is to propose a solution to the following problem. Money, unlike every single other commodity, does not lose any of its value over time. $1 today is $1 in a billion years. Yeah, I know about inflation. We can talk about that later. But in principle, money does not decay in the way that a desk does. It doesn't go out of style the way all of our clothes will in 2 months. It doesn't rot like food. And yet, it's supposed to be the representation of the value of all these things. And this morbidity that Keynes is talking about, this obsession with death, right? Is this gothic, kind of fetish we have for money. Is this undead thing, like a vampire, that stays alive by sucking the rest of the life out of the economy, turning us all into zombies, right? It's Halloween. All the time in capitalism, it's Halloween. So one of the ways to change the money that was proposed by a German thinker named Silvio Gesell was to actually make money lose its value over time, like everything else. And this is a way of making some really important changes. And this is actually a very simple idea, and technologically we are in a better position to do something like this than we've ever been before, because so much of our data is coordinated, and we have incredible systems of communication thanks to the internet. So Silvio Gesell proposed a tax on the hoarding of money called a demurrage charge. In French, if you demure, or in English too, if you demur, you stay. And the idea is to penalize people for sitting on or staying with their money. Okay? So it's similar to what some of you may know from your economics classes, it's called a negative interest rate, which is something that sometimes the Fed uses as a tool to encourage lending. It did this for a while after the 2008 financial crisis by adjusting the the nominal rate of interest so that it's below the real rate. That makes it so that it actually is more expensive to keep money than to invest it. But of course, there's no discourse that makes this too obvious, lest all of us start panicking that Daddy's not in charge anymore. So the idea of making this explicit, though, is to realign money power with our values. And this is an extremely simple and elegant idea. The money you have is worth its value for only a limited time. There's all different kinds of ways to do this. It can be, over a period of months or years or whatever, that your money keeps the same value, and then after that, it starts to be taxed. You start having to pay a fee for not having spent it. But if you spent the money again within the correct time period, then you avoid the tax. And this provides an incentive to keep money in circulation. In other words, to make it start functioning again as the medium of exchange of values that we think it's supposed to be. It would also make it impossible, and this is the more important thing, for those who have money to also command any kind of special social power above and beyond any other producer or consumer of goods and services. Investment, and indeed the flow of money itself, would then reflect use values, those goods and services and creations and uses of time individuals and societies actually find jointly or individually worthwhile. Our lives. Money would be nothing but what it was supposed to be, a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value for any possible combination of values people find desirable, without anyone being able to hoard abstract representations of the movements of those values as a proxy for real social power, which is effectively what financial speculators can do. They can win no matter who loses by having made the right bets. We would no longer be held hostage by banksters or by Wall Street, who can maintain their leverage over the rest of the economy because the money they have to invest never fades, never decays, and unlike everything else that is truly cool, never goes out of style. Truly cool, truly good money would be a living thing that would morph and mutate and even die like the rest of us. And for those of you who are Bitcoin fans out here, this is part of the problem with Bitcoin, is that it also, like the dominant money form, retains its value forever and is also subject to hoarding. The other problem with Bitcoin is that it's ecologically destructive because it requires massive amounts of energy to run the programs that it takes to mine it. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. Now, from my point of view, the really interesting question when it comes to money is not how to imagine the possibility of another currency, let alone the possibility of a post-capitalist world and a world without catastrophic inequality and the destruction of the earth as a viable ecosphere for most human and animal and plant life. I would argue that the solution to most of these problems is very clear and also completely within our reach and doesn't take much imagination. There are increasingly elegant ways to coordinate information sharing that would make, for instance, a time decay currency feasible. The question is not how to imagine a better monetary future. The question is really, what is holding us back from implementing it? Why are we so attached to the form of suffering and domination that we live under that we have come to identify it with freedom itself, insofar as we believe wholeheartedly in the myth that in free markets lies true human freedom? This is the point at which the metaphysics of money becomes important and useful. By understanding the history of the various origins and uses of money, we can take inspiration from the fact that our relation to money has been a contingent fact of complex history, not some kind of natural, let alone inevitable development of life on Earth. above all, understanding the history of the efficient and formal causes of money, why money has had certain forms, and what power those forms were thought to convey, can help to expose the twisted roots of our current and enduring attachment to our own subjection through money power. The problem Keynes said was for the psychologist. This is a much longer and more complicated and fascinating exercise than I have time to show here, but I want to close with a few stories while we're still here. There are two dominant origin stories about money: the barter story and the story of tribute or sacrifice. The barter story is the preferred one of the so-called Austrian and neoliberal schools that have dominated what's also known as the Washington Consensus and the teaching of economics for most of the last 30 years. The latter story, the tribute or sacrifice story, is a more Keynesian story that would have been more popular in the economics profession in the post-war era until the ascendancy of neoliberal ideology in the late 70s and early 80s. All that may be neither here nor there for you guys, but here's the point. The barter story is a story that money came into being to facilitate exchange between private individuals trying to survive and outdo one another in accumulating wealth. The tribute or sacrifice story is that money came into being as a way to distribute scarce resources as directed by societies in the form of states or religions. Now, based on the available historical and anthropological evidence, both of these stories are wrong. The origin of money is not in barter, and it is probably not in something like tribute or sacrifice either. It doesn't mean that money hasn't, from time to time, facilitated barter, or that it doesn't facilitate exchange today. It does. It also doesn't mean that states or religious communities did not actually organize economic life, as was in, say, ancient Sumeria, and use something like unit of account money in order to keep track of the movements of goods and services. That's all true. Here's the problem. The problem is that when it comes to the ultimate origins of money, money doesn't have a single origin. It has a lot of different origins. And let me lead you into that in the following way. First, I want to tell you a little bit about what is wrong with the barter story. The most famous exponent of the barter story, I've got about 5 minutes left. Okay, it was Adam Smith, and in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith famously said, "Oh yeah, if you get in a boat and leave England and go across the water and check out the Native Americans, you'll find, that in every little village, there's some guy who specializes in arrowheads, and there's some guy who specializes in making moccasins, and they get up every morning and wander into the center of the village and, try to figure out, how many arrowheads are worth how many moccasins." Well, Adam Smith also said that this is, this kind of specialization of labor is, the ultimate bedrock of society, and that it was the way that people came to survive more and more efficiently and eventually become the great thing that we know as modern capitalism. Now, quite apart from there being very little historical or anthropological evidence that any culture has ever organized itself around that kind of bartering in order to meet its basic needs, and there isn't. It's just not there in the historical or anthropological record. Somehow, even though the anthropologists have been screaming this at the economists for the last 100 years, it's just not getting through. But quite apart from that, it actually just empirically wasn't the case. I mean, if Adam Smith had actually gotten into a boat and came over to, upstate New York, around the time of the American Revolution, he would not have found people specializing in making arrowheads or making moccasins within, the Iroquois nation. All of the basic goods and services used by those kinds of communities, and this is much more is a much more accurate picture of archaic human life generally, was done through communal stockpiling and storehousing. Everything that anyone would need on a day-to-day basis was held in common and was distributed as was needed by anyone in the tribe. The very idea that one would have to haggle or bicker or barter to meet one's basic needs would have been and is perceived as something of an affront, if not an outright threat, to the survival of the members of the group. Human survival depends on solidarity. Human survival depends on the communal solidarity of small groups that band together and provision one another on a day-to-day basis. And something like trade really only comes in when it comes to something like what we would call international relations or foreign relations. So let me just finish then on this point. I'll give you some reasons why the tribute story is wrong as well. But here's the problem. Let me put it this way. Money works because our personal, private, individual ambitions and dreams and expectations cannot be separated from the social, cultural, and earthy ecologies in which we exist. Everything about money as a complex, contingent historical phenomenon is missed if it is placed outside of the inseparable dependency relations that it always reflects and inflects. There are many metaphysics of monies because there are as many monies as what Simmel called claims upon society. Although economists and social scientists are constantly trying to treat money as a unique, inseparable social phenomenon, it cannot be separated from the other phenomena which is closely bound up with quantification, language, power, gifts, exchanges, desires, debts, waste, and creative expression. And yet most contemporary economics textbooks present the myth of barter as if it were a fact. Even Marx was convinced of this. But no anthropological evidence exists that any society was ever originally organized around barter. The closest thing in archaic economies to barter is gift economics, and basic needs were always met through communal storehouses or hunting and gathering. And this is for good survival reasons. Excessive competition would have destroyed small communities. The other origin story that's wrong is the tribute or sacrifice story, which relies on the myth of society as a kind of stand-in for God. On balance, there's much more historical evidence actually for the emergence of money as tribute and as sacrifice, which eventually became taxation. But the problem with this story is that it makes the medium of exchange function of money dependent on the store of value and unit of account functions and puts centralizations before markets. It's thus politically unpopular in societies like the United States, and it's the reason why our economics profession is resistant to it, because we highly prize individual liberty, and we tend to think of government as an anti-economic force of control or interference, when there's a lot more evidence it's actually governments that brought markets into existence in the first place. But more broadly, this myth that we all owe some kind of a debt to society presumes that we know who we are, whether as state subjects or as nationalities or as races or as family members, in a way that we in fact do not. Our obligations are complex, so it can only be a contingent historical matter that duty to so-called social obligations can be expressed in the form of paying taxes. Norman O'Brown and others have discerned the psychological roots of the debt complex as a fear of enjoyment, presumably the fear of enjoying the many, many connections and overlapping bonds and loyalties and attractions we naturally feel. But these myths are two sides of the same coin. One presumes that money is a tool in the hands of the individual that is then usurped by the state. The other presumes money is a tool in the hands of the state usurped by the individual. Both presume that money is a neutral, transparent object that can be bent to the will either of the state or the individual, but both are wrong. Money does not emerge in context of scarcity in order to help individuals meet desired ends. It also does not emerge as an abstract quantification of debts owed to superior powers, ancestors or God or the state, that helps to keep the excessive pride of individuals in line and so to redistribute wealth. The actual origins of money are all quite strange. They were never expressions of the power of states or individuals, never tools in the hands either of hegemonic states or freely autonomous individuals. Money originated, as far as the historical record shows, in several practices that seem to have nothing to do with economics as we currently think of it, as the science of how to allocate scarce resources to given ends, or to maximize the preference schedules of competing individuals or firms or societies. The much more queer origins of money are that, on record, the most ancient mentions of money we have fall into these three categories. They are either ways that people use of redressing wrongs. This is the origin as Wergeld or man price in Germanic societies. And this is something that Nietzsche picked up on in the Genealogy of Morals, but it's much more accurately gone into in David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. This is one of the earliest actual historically recorded instances that we have of something like money is in the payment of penalties. If my horse accidentally runs over your potato field, what are we going to do about it? Well, maybe I'll give you a horse, one horse. One horse equals one potato field. I don't know. Sure, fine, sounds good. Okay, that is something that is very, very archaic and ancient. The other one is that it's a means of doing the opposite of what money does now, which is of including the less fortunate within the ambit of wealth and indeed the safety and meaningful life that is enjoyed by the more fortunate. And the best book on this is Richard Seiford's book, Money in the Early Greek Mind. And he argues that one of the reasons that coinage was adopted so early in certain parts of Greece was its resemblance to the tokens that were given to the poorest in the community so that they had something to present in the temple at the religious holidays when the feasts were being served. They actually broke off bits of the spit, and this is where the word drachma comes from in Greece, but they were actually broken into little sort of coin-sized tokens. And if you couldn't afford to bring any meat or anything to be at the religious festivals, which were really ways of feeding people, you could bring these instead. And of course, it's all kind of a joke because it was really being underwritten by the wealthiest anyway. It's a massive form of charity. That's another very early form of money. And finally, and most importantly, the very earliest form of money is that of a gift, which is a very complicated and really interesting form. This is literally the last page, and then we'll have some discussion about this. But a lot of people like to talk about how living in the gift or some kind of gift economy might be an alternative to capitalism. But actually, it's not that simple, because what gift economies, as discussed by Marcel Mauss, actually were sometimes lighthearted, sometimes very serious prestige battles between groups of people who were relative strangers to one another. So, if I live on an island 20 miles from you, I take care of myself and take care of my own, and you take care of yourself and your own, but we'd rather not go to war. So maybe a couple times a year we're going to agree to have a huge party where I'm going to bring all the cool stuff that I make on my island and that's been with me forever, and you're going to do the same thing from yours. We're going to have a big party, and maybe we'll exchange people to be married to one another, or we'll show each other how we worship various gods, and we'll just celebrate ourselves basically. And there's a lot of tension and even agony involved in these gift economies, and it's reflected today in the pressure that we feel to give and receive gifts. If you get a nice present from somebody, at Christmas, you're going to instinctually feel a certain amount of pressure to reciprocate it if you can. And it's also embarrassing to get a gift from someone who is a lot wealthier than you, because you won't be able to do the same for them. And all of this goes back to very, very, very archaic patterns of how human beings figured out how to interact with others who were relative strangers to them. So you wouldn't get into this kind of thing with people that you knew or were part of your tribe. Like I mentioned with the Iroquois, that would all those relationships would have been communistic, if you want, or communal. where we would each, draw from common storehouses and give what we had. So, in gift economies, there's you have an early form of money, which are these tokens that would circulate around as signs of honor and respect. Not counting anything, but simply signifying you are of a different kind of value than I am, and I respect that. I see that. And also, there's a little bit of friendly competition that goes on, whose gifts are better than whose. And, there's a lot of games that are played around that, but it's all intended to keep violence at bay. It's intended to keep people who don't know very much about each other friendly. So just from this very, very quick 5-minute tour of anthropology, we can see that when it comes to the actual origins of money, as opposed to these stories we have about barter or about tribute, which are functions that came much later than these earlier ones. You can see that money is never a neutral tool in the hands either of a state or an individual that has preordained and pre-planned needs, desires, dreams, and plans. Money is not a neutral medium of exchange or completely arbitrary unit of account or completely abstract store of value. It always has local color. It's always inflected by the way it's used, and thus its nature is never to be one thing. It is always already many things, the many things done with, for, and by money. This is the last slide here. So, what's the point? Money cannot be a neutral medium of exchange. It is never an arbitrary unit of account, and it's never an abstract store of value. And maybe that's not a problem, but rather the solution to the problem that we weren't looking for. Perhaps the revolutionary dream we all share is not in front of us in some pie-in-the-sky utopia, but behind us all along, in the activities and needs and desires we've had for as long as we can remember. If money could be linked, and it can be, to what we actually need and do and make, it could represent the ambitions we actually express in the present without being held hostage by the outcomes of the past. Then money would not be a form of punishment and control, but a form of the one thing we need most, the forgiveness of debt. Demurrage currency would immediately begin the process of the cancellation of unpayable debts. That debt forgiveness would manifest not as some kind of crazy devolution into economic chaos, but ironically into the very activities money originally emerged in. The considered discernment of how to right wrongs, the means by which to include the less fortunate in the society of the more blessed, and above all, the giving and receiving of gifts, where such gifts are not charity nor even altruism, but the fascinating, sexy, clever, creative, and unforeseeably enjoyable ways human beings express themselves on Earth, and continue to do so against all odds in the ghettos and kill zones of diabolical neoliberal capital. Thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions, because Josh's 5 minutes turned into 15.
It did.
But I'm going to let you sort of, if you want to.
Question.
So
yeah.
So I was interested in your redressing wrongs, unfortunate and the gifts. And it seems to me that redressing wrong boils down to bartering. Horse versus land. But now the horse was the land was trampled and you were taking it on. That's sort of a bartering kind of system, trying to find some equality, and now we're going to barter to make it equal. And then the unfortunate, giving coins, that became to me almost like the tribute piece that you talked about. And finally, gifts sounds to me like power play, political power play. So I wasn't convinced about your argument.
Okay, I can put it simply then, is that if we don't have something like a demurrage currency, then you're absolutely right, and redressing wrongs will devolve into barter, and the gift economy will become sheer power play, and the inclusion of the less fortunate, will just become this sick game of tribute that we're involved in now, where we all pay homage to those poor souls who don't know what to do with all their money. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's the argument, is that we need to change the form of currency so that doesn't happen. Do you see the point? So that's the argument for changing the currency, because the point isn't.
What does the currency become then? I mean, I'm not clear where we go. I know that you attempted to show. I lost you at some point because I don't know where we go to.
Well, I mean, part of my argument is that we don't go anywhere. The part of my argument is that we go back to what we've been doing all along. We need, as humans in society, to, among other things, do those essential things of redressing wrongs, including the less fortunate, and creatively exchanging gifts. Okay, so the problem is, why are we attached to a money form that makes it harder and harder and harder for us to do any of those things?
I guess my point was then the evolution goes back to where we are. I understand going back, back to the beginning. But how do we avoid coming back to where we are today?
Okay, but it's a paradox. We might not be able to end up back. We might not be able to avoid ending up right back where we are today. It's not about having a guarantee. It's kind of like having a disease that needs to be cured now, and that disease is the current money form. Okay, so the hope is, and it's a hope. The hope is that if we release ourselves from the particular kind of oppression that this particular kind of money form is. That's linked to unserviceable debts and the need to not only to work, but to convert more and more of human social life into things that can have price tags, including especially education and healthcare. If we want out of that, then we have to disincentivize hoarding money. That's one of the steps in the process. Sorry?
The hoarding of the money isn't your problem.
It's part of the problem. It's not that we'll end up in utopia just by fixing the currency, because there's a lot of other things that have to happen. I mean, those psychological problems that Keynes was talking about make us addicted to our own oppression in various ways, just like we stay in bad marriages and have friends that aren't good to us and all other things that human beings have been doing all along. I think you were next.
So I was interested, I guess, by the fact that taxation didn't come up more, because a lot of people who are worried about inequality, they think there's a fairly straightforward solution, which is have a really aggressively progressive taxation system and to close all these sort of offshore havens, and that the problem isn't really the monetary system at all. So I take it, I would assume you think that doesn't work and that you need a more fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with the idea that we don't need to change the monetary system, but I agree that something like taxation is precisely what's at stake here in a demurrage currency. I mean, effectively, demurrage is a tax on hoarding. So one of the immediate consequences of instituting a demurrage currency would be for people who have, untaxed, currently untaxed or untaxable incomes offshore to start relinquishing them.
So it basically is a wealth
tax. Yeah, it's a form of it. It is well taxed, yes. It does other things too that also need to be done, which is it actually takes steps toward preventing situations like this from happening in the future. David, I think you're next.
So this is a great talk. This is really fascinating, and I have a particular perspective on it, given the fact that in some small number of
you're going to retire. I knew you were going to bring this up.
To my shock. In the last few years, I've come to realize that effectively, to continue the style of living that I have now, which I don't consider to be luxurious, though on a world stage it surely is, I have to be a millionaire. Essentially, that's about how much I need in order to be able to count on being able to draw money out over some decent period of time, before I kick the bucket. We're in a period of demurrage in a sense right now, in that, the value of the money, I put more in and the value keeps going down. But this is going to reverse pretty soon, and I'll probably reach my goal. And I'm wondering what you would think should happen instead of that. That is to say, if I'm not able to accrue value on money that I set aside so that I retire, then either I end up on the street, or other people have to take care of me.
Right, and that's the answer, is that other people should be taking care of you. And from my perspective, did I cut you off?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I thought one more.
Okay.
Please,
Okay. So I follow David Harvey's thought on this point, which is that the immediate solution to that problem is to do away with all retirement funds immediately and have a much more robust Social Security, so that the care of everyone who isn't working is tied in the present to the labor of people who are actually working, and that's all. So because remember the whole point here is to eliminate stores of wealth that aren't actually representations of value in the present. Okay, and if you're asking, well, how do we protect ourselves against future contingencies? Well, in some ways we don't, at least not as much as we were used to. We don't insure ourselves in quite the same way that we're used to. We make ourselves a little more vulnerable and fragile. Now, on the other hand, you could argue that we're going to make ourselves a lot more robust. I mean, because it will also be part of a much broader incentivization to not just have more people working in the present, but of course having people do more of the kind of work that they want to, which I would imagine, based on how many people are willing to do this for free right now, would include taking care of the elderly and the infirm and so on as a major part of what makes for at least some people's fulfilling lives. So yeah, I mean, it's a corollary of my argument that we would have to move away from retirement funds and move towards a much more robust form of Social Security.
So technically we're out of time, and we do have to give up the room for a class that's coming in afterwards. Like maybe one very quick question.
David?
Has exchange value completely outpaced use value? Because we've been giving out interest since the British National Bank gave out interest rates, 200 years ago? And ever since that's been going on, if you liquidate the entire world right now, would it come close to how much money we have in exchange value and just banks and zeros and ones? Like, you could not buy everything and you'd still have money left over. So if you go back to use value, we just don't have an exchange rate for that. There's just not enough things in the world to buy or produce. You look at China today, they try to always have manufacturing goods, so they keep building ghost cities, and nobody lives in them, but they still keep equating that to use value, and it's just...
Well, we do the same thing, but instead of creating ghost cities, we hollow out the inner cities and then systematically kill everyone who's black that lives there. That's our version of doing that. But your point, I mean, if I understand it, is that is precisely the reason why we need to change the currency, because if you allow for money to be made off of money, which is essentially what the rate of interest is, then there's always going to be a portion of the currency that isn't attached to any what we would call real value or goods and services. Right, maybe right here. Yeah.
Yes. So I really want to know, according to Hayek, the Austrian economist, he said that money is one of the greatest invention to obtain freedom. Mm-hmm. So I want to know, how does money relate to freedom?
A big part of my argument is that Hayek is only right about that if money doesn't function in the way that it currently functions. I mean, Hayek and other neoliberal thinkers after him, especially Milton Friedman, recognize that money will only make us free if we actually have the ability to participate in markets. But the more certain people hoard money, the more it cripples the presence of other people, abilities to express themselves in marketplaces. And, some neoliberals say, the more hardcore ones say, well, this is all a matter of sort of evolutionary sorting, and the strongest enterprises and the smartest people will always figure out how to, succeed. And so in that sense, freedom gets kind of equated with success. So if you're unsuccessful, you were never really free, which is a paradox, to put it mildly. But I think more level-headed people, even in the Austrian school, recognize that, for instance, you would probably need something at least like a minimum basic income in order to give everyone the chance to compete in markets and for then money to be part of a technology of freedom that Hayek wanted it to be.
So I hate to be that guy, but I'm going to be that guy.
I am more than happy to take more questions in the hallway. I'm sorry I didn't realize you were up against
Thank you so much. Thank you guys all for